I'm Kristen McKenzie, president of the Fine Arts Society of Peoria, and I want to welcome everyone this morning. I want to welcome you to the second lecture in the Fine Arts Society's 2020 to 2021 series, exploring how artists have, David, you're going to have to take over admitting, how artists have looked at the environment. Oh, somebody has their sound on. If you can all please mute yourselves. We're getting some unwanted sound here. Our series this season is exploring how artists have looked at the environment over the past 2 centuries. While we would much prefer to meet in person for coffee, tea, and delicious homemade treats, and actually meet the speaker in person each month, we embrace this opportunity that we have now to host virtually a much broader group of friends, colleagues, students, and potential members. This is where I invite non-members to consider joining the Fine Arts Society and give a reminder that we welcome donations to support our work exploring, expanding, and enlivening the arts in Peoria. And you can find more information on our website and our Facebook page. Can you all hear me? Nancy, you can hear me. My husband can't hear me. Turn your volume up and you can watch it from here. Sorry about that. I thought I had him set up. We'll catch him going later. Our speaker today is Dr. Nancy J. Siegel, professor of art history at Towson University in Towson, Maryland. She holds a bachelor's in art history from Franklin and Marshall College, as well as a master's in art history and museum studies program certificate and a PhD in art history from Rutgers University. Dr. Siegel specializes in American landscape studies, print culture, and culinary history of the 18th and 19th centuries, and has written and lectured extensively on a number of 19th century topics. Additionally, Dr. Siegel gives historical cooking demonstrations, plus serves as a culinary consultant for museums and nonprofit institutions. Sounds like a fun topic for another time. Dr. Siegel has authored too many pertinent articles and books on American landscape painting for me to list here. She's curated several important museum exhibitions, and she teaches an honors course on art and environmentalism, among other topics. So she's eminently well prepared. Today, let me just see. Oops, no. Today, Dr. Siegel will discuss the Hudson River Valley School of Painting in 19th century America. Residents of our young republic looked at the landscape around them differently than their European counterparts. American artists found in the natural beauty here the subject matter for a distinctly American art that they sought in order to distinguish themselves from European traditions. Dr. Siegel will explain this and the messages they conveyed through their paintings, giving special attention to a group of adventuresome women artists that has until recently been overlooked by scholars of the Hudson River Valley artists. In addition to examining their careers, lives, and artworks, Dr. Siegel will explain how the female artists met and overcame the many obstacles that challenged both the advancement of their careers and access to their given subject matter. Now let me stop sharing and we can let her take over the screen. Dr. Siegel, welcome.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone from Baltimore. I wanted to thank Kristen so much and the Fine Arts Society of Peoria for this invitation to speak with you today. And although being in Peoria isn't possible, I hope that you're all in a comfy chair and have a nice cup of tea like I do here as we turn our thoughts to better days and getting out of doors and back into nature. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Here we go. And my talk today provides an historical backdrop to some of the ways in which landscape painters, women artists in particular, have come to appreciate and capture on canvas the beauty and awe found all around us. My research in part stems from an exhibition I organized a number of years ago for the Thomas Cole National Historic Site in Catskill, New York, called Remember the Ladies, Women of the Hudson River School. My intention for that exhibition was to widen the scope of knowledge on American women landscape painters of the 19th century and to introduce the public to as many women artists as their work would fill on the walls. And as I researched the history of women's artistic and educational opportunities, I was repeatedly reminded of Abigail Adams' quote to her husband: "I desire you would remember the ladies. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion." I realized that Adams' ideas concerning the position of women in the soon-to-be nation and their ability to express themselves freely became increasingly important in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In particular, women would play an active role in the acquisition of knowledge about the newly established United States, including a desire to explore the landscape. By the early decades of the 19th century, women traveled in increasing numbers to experience American scenery and wrote poetically of their adventures. Many of these women aspired to paint professionally. They produced works of art positioned high and low on the artistic hierarchy and were inspired by the landscape, just as Thomas Cole and Asher Durand and Frederick Church were. And this was great until I found the following article: Die Frauen in der Kunstgeschichte, Women in the History of Art, by Ernst Gull, a professor of history from Berlin, who wrote, "Volumes have been written on the long disputed point whether the mental powers of women be equal to those of man. Women, say the defenders of the present system of things, have opened up new vistas in the realms of thought, with a few brilliant exceptions. They have produced nothing really great in art, and an exception does not form the rule. What they have not achieved in the course of 18 centuries, they are not likely to achieve in the 19th. We have no female Raphael or Michelangelo." Now, when I'm speaking in person to a crowd, this is when I hear numerous growls from the audience, so feel free to add your own growls. Gull's essay appeared in the 1858 American edition of the Westminster Review and reflects the intellectual and aesthetic environment into which works by women artists were received. Gull summarized the state of the condition of women artists as he believed it to exist. He continues, "The profession of the painter would seem, in many respects, particularly fitted for women. It demands no sacrifice of maiden honesty or of matronly reserve. It leads her into no scenes of noisy revelry or unseemly license. It does not force her to stand up to be stared at, commented on, clapped, or hissed by a crowded and often unmannered audience who forget the woman in the artist." Gull's assessment was a mid-19th century barometer for the perceived abilities of women in intellectual and artistic realms. However, by the middle decades of the 19th century, increasing numbers of women artists aspired to paint professionally, to not only paint professionally, but achieve personal and financial success as artists, in part as a result of the training they acquired abroad. Despite setbacks such as inflated tuition for women at the Académie Julian in Paris, their ability to travel beyond the United States is part of a larger discussion related to the developments in the areas of tourism and education for women in the 19th century. And this talk serves to broaden the discussion. But who are these women? They are artists such as Jane Stewart, daughter of Gilbert Stewart, Sarah Cole, sister to Thomas Cole, Louisa Davis Minot, Harriet Caney Peale, wife of Rembrandt Peale, Susie Barstow, Mary Josephine Walters, Laura Woodward, and Eliza Greatorex. Beyond their supporting roles as wife, sister, niece, and daughter, these are talented and accomplished landscape artists who until recently have received little scholarly attention. Working alongside male companions or alone in their studios, they captured on canvas the beauty and awe they experienced out of doors. They exhibited their work at the National Academy of Design, the Artist Fund Society, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and the Boston Athenaeum, to name but a few of the prestigious venues in which their work was shown annually. While the moniker of amateur artist was available equally to both men and women, the designation of professional artist was far more restrictive for women. Reading personal accounts and diaries as early as the 1820s, we know that women traveled to and explored places of natural beauty. A growing tourist industry in America by the mid-1820s resulted in the increased production of travel guides that highlighted specific sites that women might enjoy viewing, as well as offering detailed advice on appropriate clothing to bring on such excursions. Robert Fulton and Robert Livingston's 1807 sail from New York to Albany aboard the North River steamboat launched the inauguration of steamboat travel along the Hudson River. As more Americans began to consider the Hudson Valley as a tourist destination, steamboat companies flourished by mid-century, offering passengers efficiency, speed, and views of the Hudson River. The Lady Clinton and Lady Van Rensselaer afforded tourists, male and female, a passing panoramic view of the Hudson. And by 1848, the new steamboat, the Rip Van Winkle, made the trip 3 times a week. Although the name of the steamer doesn't instill notions of time efficiency, staterooms and berths were always reserved for railroad passengers, acknowledging the multiple means of transport tourists often required. Women traveled to sites of interest in the company of friends, often kept safe from the peering eyes of men through their relegation to ladies' cabins on canal boats and steamboats. Affordable travel not only allowed greater access to view the landscape, but to be viewed as well. Willis Gaylord Clark commented in 1835, quote, "Did you never particularly relish a jaunt on board a steamboat when you found some beautiful women there? Tell me honestly, did they not, those strangers, materially enhance the delightfulness of the journey? It is one of those pleasures that nobody writes about and everyone feels." Undaunted by the prospect of being observed, Rachel Wilmer wrote in her journal of her tour of the Falls of Niagara, the 26th of June, 1834, quote, "In viewing the scene all around, I was delighted and think it surpasses all description. It was calculated to raise my thoughts from nature up to nature's God. Walked to Table Rock where Sam Patch took his leap, then under the spray until quite wet. After dinner, we took the steamboat to Buffalo, arose early and walked down to the shops of Indian curiosities, purchased some bracelets for the servants, and did a little shopping." Excited by the prospects of travel, the young Boston artist Louisa Davis Minot published her observations of an 1815 trip to Niagara in the North American Review, providing extensive descriptions of the terrain in addition to the oral atmosphere. She writes, "On approaching the falls, the scene changes. The roar deepens, the spray rises a lofty column of vapor in the heavens. The rapids, which commence about a mile above the brink of the falls, now show their white heads, and the current increases its force so fast as to threaten to bear the frail bark along with it to the cataract. The sublimity of this scene is frequently heightened by a thunderstorm." What sets Minot's observations apart from letters and diary entries are the visual counterparts to her verbal descriptions of the area. In particular, her Niagara Falls from 1818, which you see here, depicts the rush of the American and Horseshoe Falls. Minot's composition is not merely competent, rather, it suggests training and expertise. The tumultuous sky, the spray from the falls, and the placement of figures to convey the geological magnitude of the site result in a convincingly dramatic scene of the splendors of nature. In her journal of the trip to Canada from 1815, Louisa's older sister, Jane Minot Sedgwick, thusly wrote to her friends of their trip to the falls. She writes, "My dear friends, this expedition has peril enough to make it an object for travelers, although on this side of the river you cannot view the scene so well below as above the precipice. Think of walking 150 feet down a perpendicular descent with the irregular juttings of the rocks for steps and trees for banisters. In some places, these steps are so distant that it is necessary to suspend your body from the limbs of the trees in order to reach them. And there are few parts of the way through which you can walk erectly. They were guided to Table Rock, where Jane makes mention of Louisa's sketching. After walking a mile down steep rocks through swamps and woods, we came to this celebrated place. We were so much delighted with this view of the falls that my sister and I, having risen with the sun and come to take our last look at them. It is on this rock that I am writing to you while my sister takes her sketch. And that's what you're looking at in the lower right-hand corner. Minot produced not one, but two beautiful paintings of Niagara Falls. Her placement of figures in this version is interesting. Note the woman in the company of a male companion, and I'm not quite sure if you can see down in the foreground, there are two figures that are tucked on the lower left-hand side. Minot adds a Native American Indian close to the falls in the lower right, while the foreground contains three additional men of different cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds. While the popularity of Niagara for travelers and artists alike increased rapidly throughout the 19th century, Minot's artistic ability bears noting. Her work appears before Alvin Fisher's The Great Horseshoe Falls, Niagara of 1820, and more than a decade before Thomas Cole's Distant View of Niagara Falls from 1830. Minot's work demonstrates that she was able to travel and experience American scenery directly. The physical experience of travel coupled with a growing interest in the American landscape, and as such, women of a rising middle class expanded their knowledge of the American landscape through artistic instruction in the areas of drawing, watercolor, and painting, promoted as part of an expanding educational program for women in the United States. Manuals dedicated to instruction in the art of landscape painting became plentiful by the early 19th century. With varying degrees of accomplishment, countless young female students filled their composition books with drawings copied from instruction manuals. Molly Brooks, for example, was educated with basic drawing skills. Within her drawing book is the figure of a young boy leaning against a tree. Her drawing is an obvious copy from page 18 of George Winchester's drawing series from 1851. Two well-known authors of instructional publications are Benjamin Coe and John Chapman. Chapman certainly intended women to gain instruction from his books, as he included vignettes, engravings of women, not men, drawing from nature at the end of each chapter of his 1847 manual, The American Drawings Book. Some such publications were written by young women artists, such as Fanny Frances Palmer's 1847 New York Drawing Book and Maria Turner's The Young Lady's Assistant in Drawing and Painting from 1833, which is a concise example of a text aimed at a female audience. Turner instructed on process, form, and materials, while providing rules for drawing on paper, stone, mezzotin, watercolors, oil painting, and print transfer. She was fully of the opinion that women could and should become artists. She writes, "Young ladies spend years to acquire their native tongue, in which they are exercised daily. But many are sent to school to learn painting in 1 quarter. This is a very mistaken idea. Painting, like all other art, is founded on elementary principles, and she who neglects them or considers the time lost which she spends to acquire them will fail of success of ever becoming a respectable artist." One pupil, Emma Healy, made copies, painted copies from engravings published in magazines and gift books. She became a watercolorist and teacher at the Orphan Asylum in Albany. Having received a diploma from the American Institute in 1846 for her watercolor flowers, she exhibited a book of paintings the following year. Her pen and ink drawing that you see here, A Picnic Party, is clearly a copy of a picnic on the Wissahickon, copied from an engraving by Robert Croom for Graham's Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine, which you can see on the lower right, of 1844. The scene depicts a group of young women and men enjoying an afternoon on the banks of the Wissahickon with a view of Fairmount Park Mansion on the hill in the background. Further, A picnic on the Wissahickon is also known as a needlework of wool and silk from Philadelphia, circa 1850, demonstrating the variety of means by which popular sites in the American landscape resonated with women artists. Embroideries, for example, like paintings, were framed and displayed in homes. It was an expensive proposition to have one's work framed, thus imbuing it with aesthetic work and value given the effort required for its production. It was chosen to adorn the wall of a parlor or drawing room for public display. How does this differ from the value ascribed to a painting by Cole or Durand? Both reflect the individual understanding of the principles of beauty and taste. While these artistic efforts have traditionally been interpreted as lovely and charming, they also further our understanding and appreciation for the American landscape in the early 19th century. Women created exquisite landscape drawings, paintings, and embroideries, often to embellish the home. That these works were never intended to grace an academy wall or garner large commissions should not take away from their value as aesthetic objects. A library or drawing room with paintings by Cole or Durand most likely shared space with framed engravings and drawings, hand-painted porcelain, and embroidered needlework. Whether painting, print, or embroidery by well or little-known artists, all were time-consuming projects. They were framed, viewed, and valued. How then is aesthetic work to be judged? Bringing attention and instruction to a more widespread audience, amateur and professional artists often supported themselves by offering art education to young men and women. Newspapers in particular were the most common form of advertisement for lessons in drawing and painting. In fact, Thomas Cole's early years in the United States were spent partly in Steubenville, Ohio, where his sisters established a seminary, similar to the myriad other educational establishments for young ladies developing in the early 19th century. In April of 1820, the Western Herald and Steubenville Gazette, the Cole sisters offered reading, writing, plain sewing, and muslin needlework, and Thomas Cole will instruct in painting and drawing 3 times a week between 6 and 8 o'clock in the evening. Thus, as an amateur artist, Cole was part of the art education industry. The watercolor class that you see here, circa 1820, depicts an instructor observing the work of a female student while maintaining a physical and professional distance. Another woman has kept her bonnet on the far left, as if eager to get to work upon her arrival to class, or perhaps late, due to pressing domestic duties. Her supplies lay neatly beside her board. These are not women working from nature, sketching en plein air. Rather, they are at a physical remove from nature, working on subjects that remain unclear, although 2 of the 4 women work facing in the direction of the framed landscape views, which you see on the right-hand side. For a woman in the early to mid-19th century, becoming a professional artist was daunting. Schooling provided rudiments of style, but hardly the rigorous training required for a professional career. The domestic world held sway over the artistic, and the validity of formal artistic education for women is part of a larger discussion on the appropriateness of educating women beyond a certain level. While countless men and women before the Civil War achieved the status of talented amateur artist, it is important to acknowledge those women who, like Louisa Minot, desired to rise above that level in the first decades of the 19th century. Jane Stewart served as an assistant to her father, Gilbert Stewart, grinding his colors and helping to complete some of his portrait commissions by filling in the backgrounds. Although Gilbert Stewart thought little of his daughter's talent, she was apparently forbidden to enter his studio if he was not present. Jane was an eager student and forged a career at a time when her father's reputation was actually in question. As a defender of the family name, Jane Stewart later wrote a series of essays for Scribner's Monthly in 1876, in which she defended her father's compositions in light of what Dorinda Evans has postulated was a possible bipolar disorder. Jane Stewart never married and supported herself, her mother, and 3 sisters through commissioned works, including numerous copies of her father's famous portraits of George Washington. Paintings here, such as Coach Fording a Stream, demonstrate the training Jane surely received from her father, as well as the access she had to painted copies. On the far left, a family makes their way across a shallow portion of a stream set within a larger landscape. The father figure in military dress looks away as his wifely companion points to the landscape ahead. Stuart's foreground is crisp and detailed, while she allows forms to soften and blend with the effects of atmospheric perspective. She frames the view with foliage as the eye moves back into a deep, recessive space leading to an open sky. Sarah Cole, younger sister to Thomas, stands out as an artist of great talent who moved increasingly in the artistic circles of the mid-19th century. Sentimentalized by Thomas Cole's biographer, Louis LeGrand Noble, Sarah would become an accomplished artist in her own right and not merely a copyist of Thomas's work, as some have asserted. She frequently enjoyed the company of her brother and often traveled as a single woman via sloops, steamboats, and stagecoaches, which were difficult, time-consuming, and oftentimes dangerous. Upon her return to the city, New York City that is, after a winter visit, Sarah wrote to Thomas on February 13, 1836, quote, "I arrived last evening after a very tedious and disagreeable journey. Mr. T. Thompson will have told you that we did not leave Hudson until late in the evening, as the stages of the Red Bird line were full, and we had to wait for the old line, which proved to be very poor and full of passengers, not the most agreeable. I was very sick all night, really and actively sick. And this Mrs. Newton, although she sat next to me, never spoke one word to me. I might have died for what anyone would have cared or known." Sarah produced numerous paintings, such as Ancient Column near Syracuse, which may have been inspired by Thomas's Column of Ancient Syracuse, displayed at his memorial exhibition in 1848. Sarah exhibited her paintings at the National Academy of Design, the Maryland Historical Society, and the American Art Union. Although she never traveled abroad, Sarah benefited tremendously artistically from the European journeys of Thomas and was aware of, and who was aware of and supported his sister's artistic talents. In fact, he wrote to Durand, asking his friend to provide his sister with instruction in the art of etching should he find time while in New York City. Although none of her printed work has been located, 3 of her etchings were listed in the catalog of the highly publicized 1888 exhibition, Women Etchers of America, at the Union League Club in New York. So significant was Sarah Cole to the painter-etcher movement that although she died in 1857, hers were the only works to be included by a non-contemporary artist. On a personal level, Sarah provided her brother and fellow artist Thomas Cole with support and understanding. Their letters often mentioned financial troubles, but Sarah also addressed her brother's concern that he was losing his artistic ability during the summer of 1836, a pivotal time for him with respect to his Course of Empire series and the recent death of his patron Luman Reed. Sarah's response to his disparaging words, while loving and encouraging, also reflects their mutual love for landscape. She writes, "In a little while, you will find that the art will return to you, and that you will return to the art with renewed pleasure. The one makes the other more beautiful. And although we have had many troubles, we have not found this life all shadows. It has been now a light and then a shadow, then a light and now a shadow. I really think that your fears of losing your art are groundless." Compassionate words from sister to brother, artist to artist. Thus, Sarah Cole is an excellent example of a 19th century woman landscape painter who traveled to and enjoyed the American landscape, was instructed in the fine arts, produced paintings and etchings, and exhibited and sold her work through professional venues. In addition to the Stuarts and the Coles, the Peel family consists of an extensive list of artists, both male and female. As Charles Wilson and his brother James believed in the democratic education of the sexes, sisters, wives, daughters, and nieces received artistic training. Marrying into the family, Harriet Caney Peel, the second wife of Rembrandt Peale, brought with her financial assets from a previous marriage and her family's mercantile business. A prenuptial agreement was signed before their union in 1840 to the effect that Rembrandt would claim possession neither to her property nor to her money. She, in fact, was responsible for providing him with the comforts of home during the 2 decades that they were married. An educated and talented artist, Harriet often assisted her husband as a copyist of his portraits of George Washington. Before and after her marriage, Harriet exhibited her paintings at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art. Rembrandt was one of its founding members. She was an active artist throughout the 1850s. Paintings such as Kaaterskill Clove reflect not the Peale family aesthetic, which promoted the primacy of portraiture and still lifes. Rather, this work suggests that Peale was well aware of a more Ruskinian approach to the depiction of nature. Given the close relationship between Rembrandt, Peale, and Durand, Harriet would have been well versed in the truth to nature philosophy espoused by both men. Regarding her gender and her career, she invariably signed her compositions H.C. Peale on the front of her canvases, or Mrs. Rembrandt Peale on the verso. Her marital status was clearly part of her identity, yet the use of her initials concealed her gender to the public, a device later employed consciously by artists such as Mary Nemo Moran. The aesthetic appeal of painting by artists such as Harriet Peale is evident, yet one wonders how women were able to accomplish the task of simply getting to those outcroppings or hillside vistas, given the cumbersome complexities of their dress. Although horses and carriages certainly assisted in transporting individuals to sites of interest, much was accomplished on foot. Travel and tourism for women was facilitated by a vast network of mercantile establishments who offered a wide variety of sundries and clothing for the lady traveler. Women could purchase appropriate garments for outdoor excursions at dry goods and department stores, such as John Wanamaker in Philadelphia, Burbank and Enright in Pittsfield, and Hortons of Boston. Unlike fashions for men, women's fashions inflicted on wearers the extra burdens of long, often woolen skirts, stockings, petticoats, and heels, making their climbs arduous and at times uncomfortable in the heat. Such encumbrances are noticeable as depicted by Winslow Homer in The Bridle Path, White Mountains of 1868. Riding side saddle for modesty, the young woman in her long white dress and gloves guides her horse carefully over the Rocky Mountains of New Hampshire without assistance. This is not a study of the forces of nature as the artist would later explore. His focus is the woman, the horse, and the landscape, in that order. Homer chose not to pair the ruggedness of nature with a male figure. Rather, he highlights the calm and serenity achieved through nature as experienced here by a woman. Homer's work reinforces the point that women had access not only to artistic training, but to experience the American landscape directly. By mid-century and the years surrounding the Civil War, increasing numbers of women were educated in the mechanical arts and obtained wider access to formal artistic training in such schools as Sarah Peters' Philadelphia School of Design for Women. As discussed in studies by April Maston, Laura Prieto, and Kirsten Swinth, women artists continue to pursue professional opportunities from the 1860s onward. Despite setbacks such as inflated tuition for women who wish to study at the Académie Julienne, culminating experiences would include participation in the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition, involvement at the 10th Street Studio in New York, and in the Painter-Etcher movement, and exhibiting at the Women's Pavilion as part of the Columbian Exposition in 1893. Additionally, Brooklyn became an enclave for women artists in the 19th century. The Brooklyn Eagle noted in 1868 in the Art Gossip column, quote, "A number of women artists in New York and its neighborhoods has for some time been steadily increasing. So much so indeed as to justify the formation of a society whose object is to assist those ladies who may need help in the prosecution of their studies." Artists such as Susie Barstow, Mary Josephine Walters, Laura Woodward, and Eliza Greatorex, for example, demonstrate the degrees to which women artists variously struggled, flourished, and earned their living in the arts. What unites each of these artists is their commitment to the formal properties of the Hudson River School including a romantic sensibility, picturesque qualities, and well-balanced compositions resulting from direct observation of the American landscape. Susie Barstow achieved notoriety in her day for Hudson River School style landscapes. While she maintained a studio in Brooklyn, she frequented the Adirondacks and the White Mountains for inspiration. She studied in France, Switzerland, Germany, Holland, and Belgium. Her studio was certainly well known to many and described as Miss Barstow's dainty studio. In landscape that you see here of 1865, the framing boughs in the foreground triangulate into the distance as the perspective leads back into an endless sense of depth in the secluded woods. Her mature style of the 1860s reflects a keen awareness of the artistic style of Asher Durand. Close to 100 paintings by Barstow have been documented, yet few today exist. So too, Barstow was an inveterate hiker. It is said that she climbed over 110 separate mountain peaks over the course of her lifetime. The 1889 issue of the White Mountain Echo noted that Barstow had climbed, quote, all the principal peaks of the Catskills, Adirondacks, and White Mountains, as well as those of the Alps, Tyrol, and Black Forest, often tramping 25 miles a day, and sketching as well, often in the midst of a blinding snowstorm. And I love just how it increases with this very romantic notion of her out in the forces of nature. Laura Woodward traveled north and south. Woodward, like Sarah Cole and many other women artists, never married, which provided her a greater, if not suspect, sense of freedom and mobility. She, like Barstow, traveled and sketched throughout New England in the early to mid 1870s, making plein air sketches as far north as Clarendon, Vermont. Her 1874 untitled painting, possibly of Clarendon, demonstrates her exceptional skill and clear commitment to the aesthetic qualities of the Hudson River School. She moved to Florida in the 1880s, and as Deborah Pollack has noted, her work contributed to the formation of Palm Beach as a resort destination. Woodward provided some of the earliest views of the Everglades and the Florida landscape for a growing tourist industry, in much the same way that artists such as Cole and Durand provided early romantic views of the Hudson River Valley in the 1830s and 40s. Mary Nemo Moran was a prominent artist in the American etching movement of the late 19th century. Of all the Moran family members, however, Mary's husband, Thomas Moran, is the most renowned, famous for his expansive panoramas of the American West from the 1870s to the turn of the century. Mary accompanied Thomas on 2 expeditions out west, one in 1872 and again in 1874 to Yosemite National Park. While it is often asserted that travel was too rigorous for Mary, her roles as mother, wife, artist, and business manager would not allow lengthy stays away from home. However, when together, Thomas and Mary shared a pronounced interest in painting the terrain of New Jersey and East Hampton, Long Island, and became prolific watercolorists and etchers of Eastern scenes. Despite a strong contrast in subject to Thomas's large painted canvases of the American West, which you see here, Mary Nemo Moran was able to impose a Western sensibility on her Eastern landscapes. They are intimate and small while allowing the viewer to experience the panoramic effect on a very personal scale. This view of 3 Mile Harbor in East Hampton, for example, is just as provocative as the expansive Grand Canyon imagery that gained Thomas fame and notoriety. Within this artistic climate of the late 19th century, however, Mary Nemo Moran found that by concealing her gender through an abbreviated signature such as M. Nemo Moran or M.N. Moran, which you can see on the bottom right of this etching plate and then signed below it on the paper, she gained membership into elite artistic societies who otherwise would have had no female members. It scarce seems a ladylike work that begins in a scratching and ends in a biting. So read an 1893 review of etchings by Mary Nemo Moran at the New York Etching Club. The matter of gender as it related to the perception of women artists was a poignant issue. Technically and formally, stylistic differentiations between male and female artists was raised often. One critic in praise of Mary's work felt compelled to justify her technical abilities based on a male-instituted hierarchy. He wrote, "Her plates, as has frequently been said, would never reveal her sex. Her work was direct, emphatic, and bold to a point even that would not be attempted by male workers in the same line of art. And her wise avoidance of affectation and incongruities resulted in the production of plates that had about them no suggestion of a woman's hand," end quote. Whether or not a gendered line could be ascertained, Mary, like other women artists, continued to receive critical praise for innovative techniques and bold compositions, despite being denied access to male-dominated exhibition venues. Widowed early and left to support her children and herself through her work as an artist, Eliza Greatorex educated herself and her daughters in Europe, and like Mary Nemo Moran, was part of the painter-etcher movement of the latter 19th century. Her paintings demonstrate her admiration for the beauty of American scenery and place her work firmly within the Hudson River School. An associate member of the National Academy of Design, she often worked en plein air as per her training, and her palette and depiction of light suggest intimate observations of the surrounding natural environment. She exhibited her work at the Women's Pavilion in the 1876 Centennial in Philadelphia, and like Mary Nemo Moran, she ventured west in the early 1870s and produced a publication that combined her experiences in both image and text. Summer Etchings in Colorado was published in 1873. At a time when those on government-sponsored expeditions were documenting the region and Thomas Moran was producing engravings, watercolors, and panoramic paintings of the American West, Eliza Greatorex was there too, exploring the rugged terrain. Greatorex's first-person description of Colorado speaks to the perseverance, driving curiosity, and undaunted quest to seek out and capture on canvas or paper those locales in the American landscape that characterized the 19th century landscape movement. This is one of my favorite passages from that publication. She writes, "I congratulated myself on being finally equipped for the tramp up the canyon. Short walking dress, stout boots, and veil tied over my much suffering and rebellious nose, for the sun burns fearfully here. My boots seemed most unfit to be trusted, my dress a mere encumbrance, my veil no shield, for looking upward, there rose before us a straight wall of stones, bedded in gritty sand. We, the petticoated ones of the party, tucked our draperies taut and snug, and went sliding, slipping, tripping, tumbling, till we felt we must be turning into atoms of an avalanche, whirling down that awful slide till we came breathless and almost stunned to the other side of the bath." Lastly, Mary Josephine Walters received training from Asher Durand. Editors of the Brooklyn Eagle were well aware of Walters' ability. "Miss Walters has attained," they write, "great excellence in landscape painting. Having been a student of Durand, Miss W. seems to have learned the manipulations of that master and sketches and paints with delicacy and a good deal of elaboration," end quote. She maintained a studio in the YMCA building in New York, lived in Brooklyn, as many other women artists had in the 1860s and 70s, and by 1880, she lived with her mother in Hohokus, New Jersey. Walters did not marry, nor did she have children. This afforded her time to travel to the woods of northern New Jersey and the Catskills, as well as freedom from domestic expectations of marriage. She exhibited actively at the National Academy of Design and the Brooklyn Art Association, in addition to venues as far west as the San Francisco Art Association. Her undated Hudson River scene attests to her admiration for the woods and waters of the Hudson Valley, in this romanticized scene of expansive sky, calm water, and framing mountains, coupled with the diminutive presence of mankind via the canoe in the foreground. The presence of the unoccupied boat suggests that this is no longer a place of wilderness, but a place of gentle commingling between humankind and nature, further reinforced by the planks of wood resting on the naturally felled trees in the foreground. And here I conclude with a current mystery. I was recently with the owner of this beautiful landscape painting by an unknown woman artist. Other works by the same artist are also in the family's collection. I believe they may be by Mary Josephine Walter. The work is signed only Mary, which would be unusual for the artist, but the style when compared to known works by Walters is elegant and relatively convincing. The story from the family is that the man who owned the painting, who was a relative, was in love with a woman artist named Mary, who died much too young in his arms. Curiously, Walters, who never married, died a year before this man married his first wife. Thusly, the painting would have been given as a private memento, never intended to be publicly displayed, and thus explains perhaps the artist's choice to sign the work simply Mary. It sounds very romantic, but it does encourage me to explore more biographical information on Walters. Who knows, maybe this love story really is true. Landscape paintings of exceptional quality continue to surface, such as this one from the Birmingham Museum of Art. While gender and cultural constructs have been contributing factors for this talk, the paintings themselves reflect the American landscape experience as it evolved throughout the 19th century. As these women were painting and sketching, they were committed to capturing the beauty, awe, and majesty of the national landscape. In addition to the artists mentioned today, there are many more women landscape painters of the 19th century that deserve scholarly attention. Julie Hart Beers, Fidelia Bridges, Charlotte Buell Coleman, Edith Wilkinson Cook, Elizabeth Jerome, Mary Blood Mellon, Evelina Mount, and this is far from a comprehensive list. It remains important then to recast 19th century American women landscape artists no longer as the exception, as Ernst Gould would have had us believe, but rather as exceptional. Thank you very much. Oh, Kristen, I can't hear you.
There. Does
there we go. Now I can hear you.
Sorry, I was muted. If you would like to stop sharing your screen, if you don't mind.
Sure,
and then people, I forgot to ask everyone to put their questions in the chat, but you can do that now or unmute yourself and ask. We have one question already from Tom Romanowski. Do you have a favorite artist among the group?
Oh, that's a loaded question. I would say for a variety of reasons, it's Sarah Cole. That I began my graduate work in the Hudson River School of Artists with Thomas Cole. You know, and an artist who's seen as the father of this movement and this loosely grouped school. And once I learned about his sister, my affinities changed dramatically. There was so little that was known at the time, and there's still relatively little that's known about Sarah, but I was so encouraged by her professional life as a woman artist in New York City and the travel that she did, just like many, many other women artists who took the sloops and the carriages and tramped for miles alongside their male counterparts up into the Catskill Mountains and produced these beautiful drawings and painted studies. There are so few works by Sarah that are known to exist, and for many years she was just discussed as a copyist of Thomas Cole. But that's not true at all. She has wonderful original works of her own. So she was really, I think, the first of these artists that I fell in love with, and I still have such an affinity for her. Right now, I'm working on these beautiful botanical studies that were done by Thomas Cole's daughter. So it really was this family affair.
Wonderful. Carol Morrissey asks if you would be able to provide, and I suppose I could do it too, but a list, not right now, but if you could send me and I can share a list of all the artists you talked about today.
Absolutely.
We do have members, Carol among them, who do like to do further research because as several other people have commented, you've introduced us to a lot of new artists today.
Wonderful. It would be my pleasure. I will also send along a bibliography that might be
perfect. And yeah. I can send that out to everyone who registered. Thank you. Joan Rice asks, in doing your research, can you describe your personal emotions? How could you not experience anger that their talents were dismissed and undermined, especially the females' higher tuition?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you so much. You know, I will preface this answer by saying that I was born in Long Island, New York, a city girl. My parents moved us out to the suburbs of New Jersey when we were young kids, but we were always in the city. And so I had developed an enormous fear of the great outdoors. I still have anxiety about deer and the like. My issue, not yours. But I had spent so little time actually in nature. I mean, we would go to Central Park if we wanted to have an outing in nature for the day. So when I started this research, I was all theory and very little practice. And I thought, well, you need to experience this. So I would hike in the Catskills, or I hiked by myself in the White Mountains. And I would go to these sites that these artists, male and female, would capture on canvas. And I was amazed by the process. And I'll also say that by the 1820s and 30s, when these women or men are traveling throughout the Catskills, there are already hotels. There are well-worn paths and fences built so that people don't fall off of a precipice. So a tourist industry that was developing in the 1820s facilitated travel. That didn't mean by any stretch of the imagination that it was easy. And when Eliza Greatorex writes about tramping, tripping, falling out west, you know, it's such a visceral description. I love that. And the more women that I became familiar with, and the more I found in notifications, newspaper printings, as well as the annual reports for the National Academy and the American Academy, that these women were showing their work alongside these much more well-known male artists, it made me think about, is this an historical sense of blindedness, right? That in the 1860s, were these women more well-known than they are sort of now? And it's true. And so history, art history, has really cast a veil in this late Victorian period over these women and sort of relegated them to a footnote at best. And so bringing them back into the main text has really been one of my priorities. And so while I consider myself to be a very cheerful individual, I will absolutely admit to you that, yes, to answer your question, I was very angry by it. I really was. That there was this decided effort, you know, to not give them their due. And you can see these works. I mean, one of the things that I loved, if I could just sort of speak for a moment, is during this exhibition, Remember the Ladies, that was at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site. And whenever I curate a show, I love to be there on opening night and just listen to what people say. And the painting I showed you by Susie Barstow that looks a lot like an Asher Durand, I was listening to two individuals talking about the painting. And it was as if, you know, it was this late 19th century discussion. They said, you know, one of them said, you'd never know it was by a woman artist. And the other said, no, I think I can see some very feminine lines there. And I thought, my goodness, right? That was just remarkable to hear these conversations, that still the idea of a value based on gender, we still do that.
Right, right, wonderful. I had wondered actually about if they were better known at the time than they are now. And two other questions, a quick one, are you an artist at all?
I am not. I am a great admirer of art, but having taken a number of art classes makes me even more appreciative for those who do. To me, it's a sense of suspended disbelief. I am in awe. And I talk to my students all the time. I always say to them, you know, if we're looking at, say, Louisa Minot's painting of Niagara Falls, with a palette, how do you choose colors to represent an entity like water that by its nature is relatively colorless? How do you do that? How do you paint reflections and light? So I'm enormously envious of all of you in the society as practicing artists, because it is a skill that I woefully do not possess and wish I had. Yeah.
We have two more questions. My sister, Elizabeth McKenzie, is asking one I had. What kinds of sources, which archives have been most helpful in unearthing the biographical information you found about these relatively unknown and undocumented artists?
Oh, that's a great question. I have spent countless minutes, hours, months, years in wonderful repositories, such as, let's see, the New York State Archives in Albany, which has the Thomas Cole papers. That's a wonderful site. A lot of smaller historical societies I think are really important to visit because they have a lot of historical data and files and folders that have incredible local newspaper accounts, or probate records are really significant. And also now, because of how many resources we can have electronically, if you sit in the library of, say, the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts, or at the New York Public Library, or Chicago as well, your great, great library in Chicago, you will have access to databases like historic newspapers. And you can sit for hours and put in keywords, and up at the very, comfort of your chair will pop these delightful articles on Eliza Greatorex, or mention of Susie Barstow. So I think newspapers are incredibly important. Something like the Brooklyn Eagle, which had the art gossip column, which I love, that these women were discussed not in the main pages, but in the art gossip column. It really diminished their significance, right? That this is just mere gossip. It's not necessarily as important. So I would say seek out every local historical society you can find. Look at historical newspapers. Those are wonderful places to find great information. And now with these digitized newspapers, you can do keyword searches. So you don't even have to look through every edition. So yeah, it's great fun to do.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I have the name of it, but the exhibit that you co-curated about these lady artists, would you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. That was called Remember the Ladies, Women of the Hudson River School. I just had to get the little catalog for it so I could show you that. And so this was really one of the first public exhibitions that focused on these women artists.
And yeah, so I can send that information out to everyone too, I guess.
Sure, we actually just had a conversation that we might do a new version of this. We might revisit the topic and do a new exhibition that broadens the scope and brings in even more artists. One of the things I loved about, after the show opened, that for months and a few years after that, I would get emails and letters from people and sending me photographs. Or saying, I've heard of this artist, of that, or hey, here's someone that I've come across. And it really opened up a beautiful dialogue of not only artists and art historians and collectors, but folks who knew that they had works of art that were hanging on the walls of their home, but they knew so little about it. And so I always like to suggest for everyone to go into your attics, go down to the basement, look at, open crates and cartons and things like that. You never know what you might find. You really might not.
Great. Actually, Wendy Greenhouse put the catalog link up on it. It's on the chat. Wendy just added that.
That's very kind. Thank you so very much for doing that. Thank you.
Yes. following up on the question about that exhibit, where was it held? How did you choose what to exhibit? Always a good question for a curator.
So it was held at the Thomas Cole National Historic Site in Catskill, New York. And I did a lot of work for the Thomas Cole House, and I did a previous exhibition for them of beautiful works of art by Hudson River School landscape painters, and they were all male. And I thought, no, we need to evolve and we need to really be more inclusive here. And so, right, I knew Sarah Cole and I knew some of her works because the Cole House has them on display. And it's a beautiful, beautiful historical home. And they're doing all kinds of renovations and new interpretive works. If you're ever in New York State, please stop by. It's just across the river from Frederick Church's home, Owana. Wonderful, wonderful. And so I had a few artists in mind already. And I had colleagues like Kathy Manthorn, who does incredible scholarship on Eliza Greatorex, and Julie Hart Beers. And so I would speak to my colleagues, and then Jennifer Krieger, who I co-curated the exhibition with, she is a gallery owner, Hawthorne Fine Art in New York City. And she specializes in women artists. And I had said to her, hey, Jennifer, we hadn't known each other before this. Would you like to get together? Would you like to work with me on this project? And she was overjoyed. And it turned out that I received no negative or rejection letters from any of the curators or private collectors that I asked to loan works from, because they were thrilled that finally the women were getting their due. And so it was an incredibly fulfilling project, absolutely.
Jennifer Lee asks if there were any Black women in the group of artists.
That is a fantastic question. And that is what I would say is stay tuned for part 2 of Remember the Ladies. Absolutely. I think this idea of branching out to artists in color and Indigenous female artists is absolutely part of this next iteration. Because as we think about inclusivity, right, we need to think about inclusivity in capital letters. So I very much appreciate your comment.
And we're not aware of too many Black men artists at the time anyway. So this would be really exciting.
Right, so an artist named Duncanson is one of the few that we know of. But yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, right? It goes far beyond the standards of Thomas Cole and Asher Duran. There are so many more artists who have wonderful stories to be told.
And that's true in any case. I mean, it's great that we have these iconic artists in a particular school, a particular style that we know and we celebrate. But it's always great, I find, when I travel, to look at the regional artists who were just as talented, just don't have the international recognition, but they have so much to share with us and tell us. So we will stay tuned and look forward to the next. Well, I will end this officially at this point, so that people who need to move on to their next Zoom meeting can. Thank you for joining us from Maryland. We were grateful to have you. Sorry we couldn't meet you in person. Thank you for bringing something that we have known about. I think everyone knows a little bit about the Hudson River Valley School and how important it was to the development of art in America, but now you've helped us see it in a new way. Feel free to stay if you'd like, Dr. Siegel, but everyone else, feel free to stay, turn your videos on, and we can have a social time here.
Wonderful, thank you so much. It was a thrill for me to be with you here today. I am going to pop off because I'm going to go teach class now.
Okay, good. I was going to, thank you so much. Have a good class.
Thanks. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Have a wonderful meeting. Take care.
So everyone should be able to start their video if they want and